So just like we talked about earlier today, all right, so the first thing you want to do is make sure that these notes are glued into page 21A. 21A. And the second thing you want to do is make sure that you give it two cuts. Here's a cut here and a cut here. So you want to glue them into page 21A, and then you want to make your two cuts. And the first thing that we're going to talk about today are integers versus rational numbers. So go ahead and open up your first tab, and you will see this right here. Okay, and we worked on this yesterday, but let's go ahead and talk about it again. Yesterday we highlighted the integers, so those positive and negative whole numbers, and then we circled the rational numbers. So let's go ahead and start highlighting integers. Our first integer is -1. It's negative and it's a whole number, therefore it's an integer. Our second integer is +5. It's positive and it's a whole number, which means not a decimal or a fraction. So that's my second integer. My third integer is 9. My fourth integer is +122. And my last integer is -6. Which means all the other numbers that we're seeing here are all rational numbers. So 4.2 is a rational number. -1/2 is a rational number. -1/4 is a -2 1/4 is a rational number, and 0.50. So now that we know what our rational numbers are, let's go ahead and write some sentences. So the question is, what is the difference between an integer and rational numbers? Okay, so let's go ahead and answer that. So an integer is a positive or negative whole number. Okay, so it's a positive or negative whole number, and you have some examples over to the left. So make sure whatever I write down, you write down. So that's an integer. We learned about integers some time ago, probably like 2 weeks ago, and I wanted to bring your attention to those just to remind you what they are. Okay, let's talk about rational numbers. So let me highlight the term rational numbers. What are rational numbers? Well, we can see from our first tab where we had some things circled that rational numbers are positive or negative, and they could be decimals or fractions. Okay, so let's write this. Whereas rational numbers are positive or negative fractions, decimals, or mixed numbers. So rational numbers are not whole numbers, okay? They are not whole numbers. They are something like -1/4 or 1.57 or -1 3/7. Anything like that is what we call a rational number. So it is not a whole number, okay? Not a whole number. That's really important to remember. So make sure if you weren't here yesterday, you have all of this written down. And then what I would like you guys to do is go ahead and go to tab 2, rational numbers, which are fractions. So for tab 2, there are 3 things that we need to be able to do. We need to be able to know what fractional parts are on a number line. We need to be able to find fractions on a number line. And we need to be able to know how to plot fractions on a number line. Okay, so the first thing, our first success criteria that we need to know for this part is, well, what are the fractional parts? Okay, you're going to need your highlighter for this. So grab your highlighter. You see between 0 and 1. So let's have our first highlighter we're going to highlight between 0 and -1 and 0 and 1, just like that. Okay? Now grab a different color. We are not counting the little tick marks, we're counting in between. So if you see here, there's 1 space, 2 space, 3 spaces or intervals, 4. Okay? That means that we are counting by fourths. So there's 1 space, 2 space, 3 space, 4 space. So that means we are counting by fours, okay? So when we say we can identify fractional parts, there are, go ahead and draw this with your pencil, please, 4 parts. There's 4 parts, okay? That's what it means by fractional parts. And on this side, there are 4 parts. You notice that the little lines are smaller because they're fractions or represent decimals, okay? So let's talk about this. So if I start here at 0 and I go over 1 part, I know I have 4 parts, so I'm going to go 1 out of 4 parts. That's my first number, okay? My second number is 2 out of 4 parts. My third number is 3 out of 4 parts. And then when I get to whole number 1, I could say it's 1, or I want you to write this down, 4 out of 4 parts. It's the same thing because we have 4 parts in our graph. Okay, let's go to the other side. Again, we have 4 parts, so I'm going to label these. I have -1 out of 4 parts, right, because I went over 1 space. Now let's go over 2 spaces. I have -2 out of 4 parts. I could put the negative anywhere in front, it doesn't matter where. I can go over another part and I can have -3 out of 4 parts. And if I go over one more part, I have -4 over 4 parts. Or just 1, -1. Either one works. So that's what it means when we're talking about parts. When I say we know what fractional parts are, I can count the parts. I know how many parts there are. Let's keep going. The second thing they want us to do is we have to be able to find fractions on a vertical number line. Okay, find fractions on the vertical number line. So I want you to write these 2 fractions down. Okay, I want you to first find 3/5. And then I also want you to find -1 and 1/5. Those are the 2 fractions we're going to find on this graph. Well, regardless of the fact that I don't have to actually count the parts, I'm going to because it's really helpful for me, okay? So I start at 0 and I say, okay, there's 1 part here, there's 2 parts here, there's 3 parts here, there's 4 parts, and there's 5 parts. Between 0 and 1, there's 5 parts, okay? Again, the same thing over here. Between 0 and -1, there's 1 part, 2 parts, 3 parts, 4 parts, and 5 parts. All right, so let's go ahead and label that, okay? So there are 5 here, 5 parts here. So between every whole number, there's 5 parts, okay? So that means if I need to find 3/5, positive 3/5, then I just go over 3 parts. So I go 1, 2, 3. So right here would be 3 out of 5 parts, okay? If you're wondering, well, is there another way? Yeah, you could definitely just say 1 out of 5 parts, 2 out of 5 parts, 3 out of 5, 4 out of 5, 5 out of 5 parts. You could do it like that too, okay? Okay, now let's find the next one. So 3 out of 5 is right here. I'm going to put a dot right there on 3 out of 5. Now this one says -1 and 1/5. So I have to go all the way to -1. So I'm going to go from 0 and I'm going to go all the way over to -1. And then I have 1 more part, 1 out of 5 parts. So I'm going to go 1 more part. So that means I am right here. So my new point is -1 and 1/5. So I go past -1 and then 1 more little part. So that's how you find parts on or fractions on a number line. Right? The last one. The last one says we should just be able to plot fractions. Okay? Well, first of all, you see these bigger lines, so let's make this a -1. Let's make this a -2. Let's make this a 1, and let's make this a 2. Now, this last time we didn't really need to plot, but I did anyways. I could have just like circled it to say, oh, I found it. They didn't actually tell us to plot, but it's no big deal. It's the same thing as just finding. Okay, so let's see. Between 0 and 1, there is 1 part, 2 parts, 3 parts. So that means it should stay the same between all the whole numbers. Between 1 and 2, 1 part, 2 parts, 3 parts. Okay, it's the same thing on the other side. Between 0 and 1, it should be 3 parts. 1, 2, 3. And yes, you should be using your highlighter for this. Between -1 and -2, it should be 3 parts. 1, 2, and 3. Cool. So we have 3 parts for every one of them. So in this case, we are supposed to be graphing 1 and 2/3, as well as we are going to be graphing, so it's a +1 and 2/3, and then a -1/3, a -1/3. So 1 and 2/3, and then a -1/3. All right, so again, don't forget the plotting fractions means we have to actually plot them, put a dot, okay? So let's go ahead and we find 1. So there's +1, okay? And now we have to go 2/3. So from here we go 1, 2. So we put a dot there, and then we write 1 and 2/3, okay? I'm actually going to change the last one. What if we made it -2/6? -2/6 instead. So go ahead and do that, okay? Because I want to show you something. For this kind, if it doesn't have the same denominator, you notice that the denominators differ. There's a 3, 6, and a 6, right? So what we have to do is, in this case, we have thirds. So I have to make sure that I can take this fraction, the second fraction, and make it into thirds. So we're going to simplify. So I'm going to divide both by 2, because I want to simplify it down to -1/3, so that we have thirds at the bottom again, okay? So when we graph it, we go from 0 and we go 1 space over to 1 out of 3. So that's where -1/3 would be, okay? Let's get one more. What if I had, no, let's go. We'll finish that later. I just wanted to kind of show you what that looks like, okay? All right, let's go to decimals. Again, it's asking us know the decimal parts, know how to find decimals on a number line, and then plot decimals, okay? Again, decimal parts are the same as fractional parts. And so if you notice here, we have between 0 and -1, we have 1, oops, let's use a highlighter. We have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. So my parts, my decimal parts this time, which by the way, decimals and fractions are the same thing. They're just different ways to write them, is 10 parts. We have 10 parts, right? So we have -0.10, -0.20, -0.30, and we can keep going and going and going, okay? So -0.40, -0.50, we're going to keep going and going and going, -0.60, -0.70, -0.80, -0.90, and obviously this is -0.1. I'm sorry, 1.00. Let me write that over again. That looks messy. -1.0. Okay, on the positive side, again, this graph ends prematurely, so it's not all there, but it's okay. We're still going to do the 10 parts, so we have +0.10, +0.20, +0.30, positive 0.40, positive 0.50, and that arrow means we could keep going if we wanted to. Okay, keep going and going. So that's how you find the fractional parts. In this case, for the second one where we're going to find the decimals, I said fractional parts, I meant decimal parts. Let's highlight. I have 1, 2, 3, 4. So I have 4 parts in between. Remember, we're going for the whole numbers, -1 and 0. And that means I should have 4 parts on the other side. 1, 2, 3, 4. Yep, I got 4 parts. So we know that it's 4 parts. Let's go ahead and write 4 parts here. All right, let's go ahead and write 4 parts here. Okay. All right, so now if it's 4 parts, all I have to do is figure out, okay, well, what's 4 parts of 100? So if I have 100 and I have 4 parts, I can divide by 4 if I want, so I can figure it out pretty easily. And I know that that's going to be 25. So my decimals are going to be 0.25, 0.50, don't worry, that's just my door, 0.75, and 100, or 1.0, okay, 1.0. All right, on this side, we have -0.25, -0.50, -0.75, and then -1.00 or 100. Right, very, very simple. So in this case, if we're looking for 2 decimals, say I'm looking for -0.25 and positive 0.75, well, that's easy. Here they are right here. I'm just going to circle them. Right, we're just looking for the numbers. Basically, we just need to write the numbers in. All right, last one, plotting the decimal. In this case, we're going to put a -1 here and a +1 here. So let's see how many parts we have. We have from 0, we have 1 part and 2 parts. And on the other side, from 0 to +1, we have 1 part and 2 parts. Right? So remember, we always want to look at the parts in between the whole numbers. All right? So here we go. I have 2 parts. And then on this side, I have 2 parts. Okay, that's pretty easy. So to figure out 2 parts, I just do 100 divided by 2, which most of you guys could probably do that in your head because we know money. So if we split $1 in half, we have 50 cents. All right. So then we're going to go 0.50. And if we had 50 cents more to that, then we end up with $1. Over here, -0.50. And if we have 50 cents to add 50 cents, we have $1. All right. Okay, in this case, I want you, what if I asked you to graph -0.54, and then I asked you to graph -0.75? Uh-oh, that's not on the graph, but we can find it pretty easy. If we go to, positive 0.75. If we go up here, we know that's -0.50, and then we go just a little bit further for -0.54. And on this side, 0.75, well, that's pretty easy. It's getting towards $1, so probably about right here in the middle. It's getting towards $1, so that's 0.75 and -0.54. So that one we're just estimating. Lastly, I wanted to talk to you, and I want you to add this anywhere you can, even if it's just on the side of the paper, on this page on 21A. But I wanted to talk to you about if I gave you some fractions. Let's draw one quick number line, okay? And I'm going to put a 0 here, and I'm going to put a -1 here, and I'm going to put a +1 here, okay? And what if I gave you something that looks like this? So I'm going to draw 5 lines, so go ahead and draw 5 lines. 2, 3, 4, 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, okay? And if I gave you something like this, I asked you to graph -4, 6, and then I asked you to graph +2/3. Okay, what if those were the 2? Well, this is easy. The first, we got to find the parts. So we go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. We know it's 6 parts. Okay, so let's go to the other side. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Oops, I accidentally drew one extra. It's okay. I'll just erase it. Okay, we should have 5 lines on each side. There, good enough. All right. So for this one, we have 6 parts, right? So I'm going to draw 6 and 6, right? So for this one, it's really easy because I see the denominator is 6. So I go over 1, 2, 3, 4. I know that's negative 4, 6. But this one has a problem because it's a 3. So how do I make it a 6? Oh, I just times by 2. That means I have to multiply the top by 2 also, okay? So I have to make it a 6. So write that little note. Make it a 6. So it would be positive 4 out of 6. So I'm going to go this way, 1, 2, 3, 4. So that would be my positive 4 out of 6. Okay? When we're drawing these, this would be a graph. It's an increment of 1/6. Write that down because you're going to need that later for your formative quick check. Okay, because I'm going to ask you to draw a graph of the increment of 1/5 for your formative quick check, okay? This graph, I want you to write it somewhere, is an increment of 1/10 because there's 10 parts, okay? It just tells you how many parts. This graph is an increment or part, that's what increment means, of 1 out of 4, okay? Because there's 4 parts on each side. And then this, as you can see, this one right here is an increment of 1/5 because there's 5 parts, right? And this one is an increment or interval, whatever you want to say, of 1/3, okay? So because there's 3 parts. So you just look at the amount of parts and it'll tell you how many intervals you need to create, right? Make sure you have that stuff written down. And then you're going to go ahead and move on to the practice.